Welcome, all you adventurous readers, to the epic worlds of Alfred Döblin, where we explore the life and works of this fascinating but little-known early 20th century writer, brought to you by the website beyondalexanderplatz.com.
So welcome to episode 7, the Weimar Twenties, where we look at Alfred Döblin, the writer, the activist and the family man. I'm Chris Godwin, your host, and I'm here with...
Katie Kavanagh. Hello, everyone. It's lovely for you to join us today. So we are 3 large topics today. So writer, activist, family man, all linked under Döblin. Where do we start? In the 1920s?
Yes. Slightly larger than the 1920s. It's the 12 years from 1919 to 1931, when the Döblin family was settled in the bustling, noisy, crowded area of eastern Berlin. And it was really his most productive decade. Incredibly active, both in terms of the literary output, in terms of his activism in various ways, which we'll get into. And he had a growing family.
So his reputation was really growing as well at this stage as a writer.
His reputation was definitely growing, although various people were a little bit suspicious of all these big epics. They didn't quite know how to handle them, and I have to say sales were not especially good. The literary critics, perceptive critics, saw the power of his writing, but the general public, who were fed on, rather easier material, tended not to buy his books.
Okay,
towards the end of the decade, his publisher was tempted to stop his monthly stipend.
Let's recap then on the 4 big epics that were published during this time.
Yes. So we had the 4 epics. As Wallenstein, this huge epic of the 30 Years' War back in 17th century Europe, 900 pages, 2 volumes. Didn't sell quite as well as the 3 Leaps of Wanglun.
And that was in 1920?
This was Wallenstein was published in 1920, and Wanglun was still being reprinted at this time. I think it went through something like 16 printings up till the early 20s. Then 4 years later, we had Mountains, Oceans, Giants, this huge futuristic epic, which almost caused Döblin to have a nervous breakdown. He was the writing was so intense. 3 years after that, we had the rather unique epic in verse called Manas, set in the Indian Himalaya, or a mythical Indian Himalaya. And a mere 2 years after that, suddenly his only worldwide bestseller burst onto the scene. That was Berlin Alexanderplatz, which became recognised all around the world as being, the big novel of the big city.
Okay.
And it was, as compared with James Joyce's Ulysses and Dos Passos' Manhattan Transfer in America, kind of the 3 big novels which had suddenly seemed to, recognise the big city, the big modern industrial city, as a worthy object of literature. But beyond these 4 epics, we had huge amounts of other literary production. His journalism, which persisted throughout the decade, where at the beginning he was producing very kind of sharply polemical essays on political subjects in the turmoil of the early Weimar years.
Okay.
Some of these he published under a pseudonym, which was called Linker Put, which is Berlin dialect for left paw.
Okay.
Right. So he was kind of sort of separating out. It's very difficult to see in retrospect very much difference between material he produced as Alfred Döblin and material he produced as Linker Put. But he was very sharply polemical essays on the political situation, cultural situation in the early 20s. He was also doing theatre and book reviews. He had a very nice contract with a publisher for the Prager Tagblatt, the Prague Daily, to do theatre reviews of what was going on in the Berlin cultural scene. And this income from this was actually very useful during the hyperinflation at the beginning of the 20s.
So obviously, because he's writing reviews, that means he's going to the theatre a lot.
Actually going to the theatre, yes. And he's actually, being able to discover, one or two fairly sort of interesting names of up-and-coming writers. But he was also, he could be quite sort of critical of the standard theatre productions.
Does this mean he had quite a good social life? So he was invited to parties and things like that in terms of being a critic and being around creative people?
Well, he was very engaged. Yes. Oh, yes. I mean, he moved in quite a wide circle of the active sort of avant-garde of literary society. But he also was constantly pestered by editors to provide a little bit of copy on sort of really quite trivial questions like, how do you organise your working day? Or, do you have a favourite place to do your writing? Silly little questions like this.
I like those types of questions. That's exactly what I want to know.
Well, exactly.
Okay.
Newspaper readers enjoyed them as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. So sometimes he'd dash off something in 10 minutes and get it off his back.
Okay.
He also wrote and produced 3 plays during the decade. There was one called The Nuns of Kemnade, which had its premiere in 1923. This was set in the Middle Ages, some rather feisty nuns in a battle with the local bishop or something, and that seemed to go off without too many problems.
Okay.
But then the premiere in 1926 of his next play called Lusitania. Do you recognise this name?
Is it the name of a ship?
And what happened to this ship?
Did it sink?
Well, it did indeed, because it's torpedoed by a German submarine.
Oh, there we go then.
With lots of civilian casualties.
I knew I recognised it.
So this was a kind of surrealist
GCSE
play
history
on
wasn't
the bodies that had sunk to the bottom of the sea,
Right.
and sort of talking to the fishes at the bottom of the sea and
Okay.
so on. But the premiere was disrupted by Nazi hooligans, jeering and shouting and so on. But as one critic wrote in the newspaper, this interjection by these hooligans really made the evening.
Oh, that speaks volumes to the quality of the play then,
Yeah,
does it?
well, but his
Maybe
next
not
one
so good.
suffered equally. In 1930, the premiere of a play called Marriage, The Heir, which he'd built up from a sort of workshop at Bertolt Brecht's place with various people battering ideas around about modern marriage. But the premiere in Munich was closed down by the police on the grounds that it was communist propaganda.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. He also early on he also wrote a kind of experimental screenplay. He was trying to think how the cinema might be able to use some sort of different techniques for switching between perspectives of different characters, or switching from one scene to another, rather than sort of rather plodding on in a kind of novelette-ish way, from one scene to scene, just taking the audience with him very easily. He wanted to try to see how you could get a modernist perspective into cinematic production.
Okay.
Then in the middle of the decade, there was a famous murder case where 2 girlfriends had conspired to murder the husband of one of them with poison.
And this is a real case.
He wrote an actual book analysing, trying to work out motive. This was Döblin the psychologist,
Right.
as well as Döblin the kind of the creative thinker and so on. But he was trying to work out layers upon layers and upon layers of possible motivations, and the interactions between the two, and the interactions with their families, and their sexuality, and so on. And this was, it's a very interesting book, and it was quite, it was very well received.
Brilliant.
Yeah. Then in the end of 1924, he spent 2 months travelling around Poland. And this was a very influential experience in his life, because in 1912, just as he was getting married with Erna, they had somehow formally sort of resigned from the Jewish community. I've no idea how he went about resigning from it, but in fact they stepped away from any connection with Jewish religion. But Alfred, by 1924, was getting quite concerned that he didn't know enough about the Jewish situation, and there'd been some pogroms in a nearby quarter of Berlin where the new immigrants tended to cluster. The worst housing and so on. So of course it was very easy for the right-wing thugs to say, "Oh, these incomers, they're taking your jobs. Let's go and show them a thing or two," and so on. So this was quite nasty. And he. Some Zionists had suggested that Alfred might like to have a trip to Palestine to have a look around. But he declined to do that. But somebody then said, well, look, go and look around in Poland. Because in Poland there are still kind of real, living, breathing Jewish communities.
Thriving community.
Not just Jews who are becoming assimilated to, a kind of standard German or Austrian or whatever society.
Yep.
So those 2 months in Poland were quite eye-opening to him, where he met people, men who were extremely poor, but had a superb kind of knowledge of the history, the religion, the culture of their people. And
did he have relatives in Poland?
I'm not aware that he actually came across any relatives. No, I think that his relatives had all been part of the mid-19th century migration westward, where they gradually became sort of assimilated more or less into the local societies. But there's another thing that happened to him on this Polish journey. The church in Krakow has a very famous altarpiece by a medieval sculptor called Fochtsteis, and he would stand there gazing at this and trying to sort of work out this this picture of the suffering man up on the cross, and this had a big impact on him. So there's the two things, the Jewish culture and a Christian imagery, both sort of working away in him in ways which would come to fruition later on in his life, which we'll get to in due course.
Okay.
He'd also been writing little essays about natural philosophy, about nature and the meaning of things. He eventually sort of reading into Buddhism and so on. He'd developed this idea that everything in the world has a soul, even inanimate matter, like a pebble on a beach.
Yeah.
Somehow it's soulful because it is matter which has been organised and brought together and organised in particular ways, which you can work out the laws by which the crystals formed and so on. And eventually, his publisher Fischer agreed to publish a little collection of these essays in the same year that he published Manas, his epic in verse. Of course, both Manas and this
flop
philosophical, they were dreadful flops. And Fischer was extremely cross. He said, "How on earth do you keep coming up with this stuff?" and was very minded to stop his monthly stipend. But then shortly after, he'd already started working on Berlin Alexanderplatz, and Fischer's wife had invited him along to their house to give a reading from his early sections of what he was writing for Alexanderplatz. And the Fischer family were very impressed with this new work that he was coming out with. So he had a little bit of respite. He wasn't going to be cast into dire poverty immediately. But on the other hand, he'd also written a little piece which was found in the archive after he died, about his kind of, the economics of writing. And he worked out that all through the 20s, until Berlin Alexanderplatz, he'd not even earned as much from all his numerous books as the salary of a typical kind of a stenotypist.
Yeah, so it was a risky business writing then.
Yes,
as a main...
and it's obviously not driven by purely commercial interest, because you wouldn't be putting all your heart and soul into this literary creation if you knew that you were going to earn very paltry monetary rewards from it.
Yeah, so it was his hobby. He was enjoying it.
Well, hobby's a very weak way of looking
Well,
at it. It was his life.
He did have
couldn't
another
help
job,
it.
though, didn't he?
Yeah.
His actual job was...
Well, he was earning from his medical practice.
Yes.
But his medical practice was also providing him with kind of direct contact with the real life of Berlin.
With the subjects he wanted to write about.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the way that the local people spoke and talk, he was a keen proponent of the Berlin dialect.
Mm-hmm.
And he said it was absolutely ridiculous that snobbish middle-class Berliners looked down upon this wonderful, productive, expressive dialect.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned earlier about Döblin as an activist and the political problems at the premieres of his plays. How much was Alfred involved in the politics and public life in the 1920s?
Well, at the beginning of the 20s, he tried to find some sort of position within the various political parties that he could agree with. He didn't want to join any sort of communist party. He was still a bit, he was pleased that the Russian Revolution had happened, but he was still quite sceptical about joining a party which wanted everybody to be a mass movement, all led, in one particular direction.
And he was keen to
too
have
individualistic.
a voice. Keen to have a voice, and that's why he was writing
as
Linkerput.
So I think he was a member of the SPD, the Socialist Party, which was the biggest party in the Reichstag and the governing party, basically. But the SPD politicians after the war, found themselves very seriously constrained by the military. Still, this defeated military had come back from the war. And the suppression of the workers' uprising in the east of Berlin in the spring of 1919, where the government was actually using artillery and bombing aeroplanes and so on to suppress this uprising. And Döblin's own sister was killed by shrapnel when she went to try to get milk for her children.
We spoke about that in a previous episode.
Yeah. So he was pretty disillusioned with the established political parties by this stage, but he was very keen to kind of protect the position of writers able to express themselves freely on various matters to do with the state, the politics, culture, life, and so on. So So he first of all he joined. There were various kind of organisations setting up. There was one which, the acronym was SDS, which was really for the Society for the Protection of German Writers. So he joined that in 1920 and actually became its president in 1924, and it was sort of standing alongside a rather more cliquish Union of German Novelists, and there was also a rather snobbish PEN Club, PEN in capital letters, which is a big kind of international organisation for writers, fairly sort of establishment kind of organisation. And then in 1925, he co-founded what he called the Group 25, trying to bring together all the kind of the left-leaning writers. But then 3 years later, the communists quit that because it was the new kind of international communist line that bourgeois leftists are our big enemy, right? And we can't be diverted from the path of global revolution by these bourgeois people. So that there was a big schism between the communists and the non-communist leftists. In 1926 and onwards, the government was trying to bring in new laws about censorship. And much as today we have the would-be censors bringing in censorship on the grounds of we must protect the children. This was about protecting youngsters from smutty literature. But the actual law itself would have meant suppressing an awful lot of kind of free expression on matters generally. So, for some years, Döblin and others were agitating against this kind of state control over the freedom of expression.
It is important, though, Chris, that we are, protecting the children from content that's not.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Döblin himself agreed that, we do need to be careful about, matters to do with the upbringing of children. Yeah, but don't use that as an excuse to suppress freedom of expression in matters that the state should really not be having any kind of control over.
Got you, yeah.
But then in 1928, he was elected to the new section of the Prussian Academy, which had been set up as the section for, it was called Schriftkunst, right? So writing arts, which was a very kind of mealy-mouthed way. It wasn't saying literature. It wasn't talking about sort of journalism or scribbling or something. They called it writing arts. But this provided Döblin with really a major new pulpit that he could use, and he immediately leapt into action and says, "Look, what we need is to build better bridges between the academy and the universities, because at the moment the universities think they know everything there is to know about Goethe from 120 years earlier, but they never have any contact with the young writers of today." So they set up a lecture series, and in December of 1928, Döblin himself gave a lecture to over 1,000 people in the big auditorium of Berlin University about the construction of the epic work, which is a very powerful and sort of influential piece of theoretical, literary theory.
That's really interesting, isn't it? That he was really, he wanted to encourage. That's what I get from that, encourage young writers coming through.
Oh, yes. And he was on various committees, prize committees and so on, where he would be advocating for sort of some, sort of up and coming writer who seemed to have talent. I mean, quite often, those recipients wouldn't particularly develop into major figures, but he was looking around for the young talent.
So he's not a recluse writing and then hiding in his surgery.
Absolutely not. And he was very hostile to the very elitist school of Stefan Georg, who produced an extremely elitist literary magazine, whose circulation was restricted only to those who deserved to receive it. Very elitist, and it had quite a little clique of young male acolytes around.
If your name's not down, you're not coming in.
Yes, yeah. So absolutely the opposite of that. And another thing he was concerned about was that the readers that were used in German schools for teaching about German literature and so on were incredibly out of date. As if they'd got stuck in the middle of the 19th century. Before these major wars, before Germany was unified, before the cities began growing beyond all bounds and so on, and giving a completely kind of false mental perspective for German school kids.
As is often the way education, kind of in terms of funding, drops off the edge.
Funding what?
Well, funding for equipment and new things like that, certainly.
Right. Okay. Okay. But
if they're not funding for new readers, then
yes, but it's not a funding issue. It's a mentality issue.
Okay.
Yeah, because the kind of the elites of the Prussian state wanted to cling on to a very conservative political and social setup, which was being sort of undermined by these enormous pressures of industrialization and urbanization and subversive propaganda and so on. So they wanted to kind of keep the school as a kind of stable conservative centre.
Okay.
Yeah. The other thing he did was he was very engaged with radio, which only began, broadcasting only began in sort of the mid-20s, but Döblin was quite quite an early user of this new medium. So he had his first radio broadcast in November of 1925, and then in 1929, Alfred and his second son Wolfgang actually had a little discussion on radio about the topic of God, which was quite daring.
Do you know, he would definitely be all over podcasting then, wouldn't he? He would love that.
Oh, yes. Yeah. And then in December of 1929, Döblin was among a group of writers who were allowed to have the first ever scriptless broadcast.
Ooh.
And if you remember, in the early days of radio, the radio presenters had to be dressed in dinner suits.
Yes.
And absolutely you could not possibly have a phone-in program because people might say the wrong thing.
Yes. If he was, this is an interesting question for you, Chris. If he was doing a podcast today, what do you think it would be about?
Oh, he could be doing 10 different podcasts, I would think.
Do you think he would have other writers, a different writer each episode?
He'd be very happy to have dialogues with different writers. Yes, I mean he would have loved this medium. He would have been able to engage, because he was very good at kind of conversing and expressing his very sort of trenchant views about various issues and making jokes. And using kind of native Berlin wit to talk about various issues. He'd have loved this medium, yes.
Very good. I digress. Carry on.
Right. So what have we done? We've done... Okay, so that was
we've
Döblin
pretty
the
much
activist,
covered him
So
as the writer.
What about the family life? Yeah.
Oh, no, sorry, that was as the activist. So we've done Döblin the writer. We've covered Döblin the activist.
Yeah.
That's quite a serious conversation. And now we're on to Döblin the family man.
Yes. So would you like to know something about the housing situation of Berlin at this time?
Yes, please.
Right. The apartment they moved into was on one of the main streets in the east of Berlin, very busy traffic street. It was on the ground floor of a 7-story block, which was the front portion of an enormous kind of wodge of 7-story blocks going back 2 or 3 courtyards, which were a result of very meticulous planning by the Prussian state government. This was even before Germany was unified. The Prussian government was worried by the huge numbers of people coming into Berlin. And so they set up a general building plan where they, said that, the buildings should be no more than 7 stories high and so on. But apart from that, they left it up to the developer. Okay. And they assumed that the developer would be providing amenities like little areas with trees and grass and so on, and places for people to stroll.
And
of course, the developers didn't.
Okay.
They filled up as much as they could with masonry. And the only open spaces were courtyards which were just big enough for the horse-drawn fire engines to turn around in.
Okay.
Right.
So,
and the other thing, of course, is that it was the front block was the posh apartments.
Yeah.
With kind of apartments of several rooms with all the normal amenities of sort of gas and indoor plumbing and so on. The rear blocks were formed of kind of single rooms, which could probably be subdivided with plywood and so on. But I mean, basically, it was a single room where you might have anything between 5 and 20 people living in that same space.
So a very busy tenement, packed out.
Oh, packed out, and of course, the population was still increasing all the time during the 20s. So yes, a dreadful situation. And of course, they didn't have indoor plumbing.
Oh no!
And these
so
these bureaucrats had worked out very precisely mathematically how many toilets they needed for each staircase. There's a toilets out in the courtyard.
Yeah.
You see, right? How many do they need for each staircase? And so, and they'd worked out. People were complaining that there aren't enough toilets.
Yeah.
Right? No. We've worked it out because most of the men are away somewhere during the day working, so they can.
So was it also a hotbed for disease and?
Oh, dreadful disease!
Illness.
Yes. No. I mean, TB was rampant. venereal diseases were rampant. Childhood death, and mortality around childbirth was very high.
Yeah.
And awful hotbeds of disease. Yes. Ooh. Yeah. So as one sort of modern writer puts it, they'd this Prussian building plan was brilliant, meticulous, all-encompassing, and fundamentally flawed. It turned Athens on the Spree to Europe's biggest working-class slum. But this was the milieu in which the Döblin family were living throughout the 1920s, and we have a description of the Döblin setup from Jola Niklas, his young lady friend. So it's a working class district in a very plain but not poor looking tenement building on the ground floor. Some steps on the right behind the front door led to the entrance to their living quarters. Then, in the afternoons, his consulting hours, the entrance door, which led directly to the waiting room, always stood open. Apart from two long brown benches, the room was completely bare, for anything not nailed down was quickly stripped.
Does that mean as in
stolen away?
Stolen.
Yes. Yeah.
Got you.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've kind of gone over what a typical tenement building would be like in Berlin. Is there anything else that you wanted to add to that?
Well, I mean, how do you think Erna was managing in this environment?
I mean, I imagine she was hating it. If it's like squalid and.
Well, their front apartment is not squalid.
No,
and they're on a busy main road, yes, but it's as Yola said, it was not a poor looking tenement building. I mean, some of their somebody actually went around to find out what sort of neighbours the Döblins had when they were living there, going through records, and they found that there was a headmaster, there was a dealer in songbirds, there was a lawyer, and so on. But then in the back tenements, these smaller rooms, you'd have lots and lots of sort of transients, like people working on the trams, or people doing.
So I guess the hustle and bustle is kind of never a dull moment then.
Yeah.
And she's got lots of people that she could talk to, I'm assuming, would she? If
yeah.
she's
Well,
kind of the centre of.
One of the problems we have is that we never hear Erna's voice. There are no letters that we know of from Erna to anybody. We have various reactions to Erna or descriptions of Erna from friends of Alfred, who, might not necessarily be the most neutral of witnesses.
It's sad,
but she was. She was working to look after the family.
Yeah, it's sad that there's not more kind of. I bet there are some really great tales kind of around her.
Yeah, well, I mean, she was looking after the household. She was looking after the household budget. Because Alfred was far too busy with his writing and his activism to be bothered with
I've got
petty
to say,
details of.
He does sound like a little bit like an absentee parent there.
Yeah, well, he was engaged with his children. I mean, there are several delightful photos that Yola Niklas took of
just busy
Alfred engaging with the children.
Yeah.
And they look like lovely children, curly headed and smiling and so on.
Yeah, it was a different time.
Yeah. But I mean, Erna was very practical. But she was the same sort of mould as his mother Sophie. Who'd brought the children through this awful period after she was just left with all the debts of her husband after he'd run away, and it took years to pay off all those debts. And Erna would type up all of Alfred's manuscripts. She insisted that she should do the typing, but then Alfred would say, "Oh, but she doesn't actually understand what I've written." So there was obviously some little bit of friction there between the creative. It's replicating his father's generation, where he had that creative man forced into a situation where he's got to have a head for business and for practical matters, and it got too much for him, and he just ran away. But Alfred's decided he's not going to run away, so they just carry on as best they can. And in fact, at the time she was pregnant with their fourth son in 1926, there are pictures of them strolling along a promenade in Nice, where they'd gone to the south of France for a summer holiday. And just, it's sort of the picture taken by one of those beach photographers,
Right.
who accost you. So, but they're looking all, sort of quite jolly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. So, Chris, obviously, Sophie, Alfred's mother, was living in Berlin as well. Were they all living together?
They weren't actually in the same apartment.
Okay.
But she was just within a few doors of Alfred's apartment.
Okay,
So
and
it was easy, it was easy to do visits. And
Alfred's brothers and sisters, were they all within Berlin?
No. Hugo, the actor, was living in Cologne at the time. The others, I don't really know much about. But, I think the timber business that Sophie's brothers had set up, I think that was still carrying on. And Alfred's older brother had gone into that timber business with them.
Yeah.
Well, they were all sort of fairly close within the same district.
Okay.
Right. But Sophie's life had become a bit easier from, I think it was 1908. Her older brother died and left all his estate to her. And so she was at last able to pay off all the debts that she'd been left by her runaway husband.
Got you. Yeah.
And she actually died in 1920. I mean, she was very ill and arthritic and whatnot at the end. Very, very sad case.
And what happened to Alfred's father in the end?
Well, he eventually sort of, he went back to Hamburg and lived with his young lady friend, not so young by now, in Hamburg to the very end. He died a year after Sophie in 1921. And the only person attending his funeral was Alfred's older brother.
Oh, that is sad. So it was a lingering, trauma for the family then.
Yeah,
They
so I suppose
didn't
the
get
question comes, was Alfred eventually able to emerge from that trauma to some kind of balanced view? And in fact, the answer is yes.
Okay.
Right? But he did it in a very interesting way. Because in 1928, there were various kind of celebrations being organised for his 50th birthday. He was already famous enough, even before Alexanderplatz, for his 50th birthday in 1928 to be a big kind of literary occasion.
Okay.
And a friend of his, a poet called Oskar Loerke, who was a reader for Fischer, had some discussions with him early on. They decided, we'll put a little book together. Half of it will be Alfred doing some kind of autobiographical things, and the other half would be Oskar Loerke going over his literary career up till that point in 1928.
So
it's a delightful little book.
An autobiography, then.
It's a delightful little book. It's really, really nicely put together. But the autobiographical materials that Alfred assembled for this were quite extraordinary, very, very artful, in a way playful, but in terms of what we were just talking about, his the trauma of his parents and his father running away and so on. He looks back at this period and writes quite a kind of a scathing piece, blaming his father for everything. But then there's a kind of inquiry panel looking over his shoulder.
Yeah.
And saying, we think you can do better than that. Can you try again? And so he writes a second version where he's beginning grudgingly to see that, if Max had been allowed to sort of bloom in his proper environment, he would have been a very delightful and creative fellow.
Oh, so he's
but
coming
still,
to...
he ran away and blah, blah, blah.
Sort of
And then
coming
this
to an
committee of
understanding.
inquiry looks over his shoulder again and says, okay, you're making progress, but you really should try again. And he writes a third time, quite a longer piece, where he comes at a very good, balanced judgment of this human situation. And
I guess he doesn't have to worry about offending anyone. It's all on him, isn't it? Because, his mother's passed away. His father has passed away. So he's got to come to terms with his own monkeys on his back.
Yes. But this, this very kind of artful, this 3-stage thing where, he knows he has to be fairer to his father about the situation because his father wasn't in control of the whole situation. He was, he just couldn't stand his artistic talents being suppressed by this kind of earn money attitude of the wife's family.
Well, you've got to survive.
Well,
Someone's got to earn the money.
yeah.
Everyone's got to earn something.
Yeah. So.
Okay. And so, very sad. So he was finally able to liberate himself from his bad memories then, we can hopefully say.
Yeah.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier Jola Niklas. Did you want to touch on who she was?
Yeah, we really can't sort of leave her out of the picture entirely because she, quite definitely influenced his writing because there are 2 characters in particular, one in Mountains, Oceans, Giants, and one in Manas, which I think he would have been incapable of creating these 2 female characters had he not met Jola.
We haven't talked about their meeting. So as I understand it, I know we've had conversations about it. They met at a party and they kind of they hit it off straight away.
Yes.
So a meeting of minds. And she also would look after their children, is that right?
Well, I mean, Erna insisted that she should be introduced to Jola.
Yeah.
It's not clear at what point Erna realised there was a kind of, sexual element to this friendship.
Right.
But, she must have known it at some point.
Yeah, she would have
But
known.
she insisted on being introduced to Jola. So Jola was introduced to the family. She was a great favourite with the children. She took some delightful photographs of the children. And in 1925, she was invited to join the family, on a houseboat along, some little back creeks in a wetland just near Berlin.
And so as Jola was very creative herself, so she
was a photographer. Yes. She was working on the margins of the Berlin film industry, doing publicity stills and things for directors like Fritz Lang. And
so I imagine they had very similar interest in the same people and similar friends and things like that.
Well, she was actually introduced by a well-known actor, Alexander Granach. So, they coincided a little bit. Yeah, but I think it was just the fact that she was interested in his creative works in a way that he felt Erna wasn't interested in his creative works.
And it's always flattering when someone is interested in what you're doing.
Well, especially if she's pretty and half your age.
That's it. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
Okay, and then so we know then that Erna. Well, tell me what happened.
Well, as I say, we only have very partial accounts of this, and we never hear Erna's own voice, and so it's a very delicate matter to get into because I'd say if you're only hearing from participants who've got their own motives and so on.
Jola remained a friend within the family until the end?
No. Erna eventually, so in the latter half of the 20s, she did become incredibly jealous and made it very clear that she didn't want to know anything more about Jola, and Alfred should not have any contact with her because she couldn't entirely prevent any more contact. But I mean, we'll find out in later episodes, when they're in exile, how things went on.
Okay, and then so Döblin, as the family man, was committed to Erna.
He took a deliberate decision.
Family.
He was not going to repeat the Max episode.
The events from his father.
Yes.
Yeah.
So he committed to stay with the family, even though, he was pretty much torn, but he wasn't going to sacrifice his growing family of 4 sons for his his own selfish purposes, shall we say.
Okay. Shall we touch on Berlin Alexanderplatz as a bestseller?
Yeah, we'll be doing an entire episode on that later on.
And so, obviously, that unexpected success after Manas and the other bit
philosophical
that failed.
one.
Yeah.
Yes.
How did that affect the family then? Suddenly, everything, would they have had, bigger income from that?
Well, I mean, this was
more success.
Such a huge success. We had, within a year, you had translation into several other languages, especially English, American English, but French and Spanish and Swedish and Hungarian and Czech, and so translations going on all over the place.
Fantastic.
So it was a worldwide hit. I mean, Döblin was annoyed that people were saying, "Oh, he's kind of copying Ulysses, James Joyce's Ulysses."
Okay.
Which he wasn't at all, because he'd only read. Ulysses was only translated into German when he was already halfway through Berlin Alexanderplatz, so he read it fairly late on and gave a very positive review of it.
Yeah.
I think we are running on a bit, and we're going to be dealing with the Alexanderplatz in a later episode. So, perhaps you say the most practical thing was that they could now afford to move to a better location.
Okay, that's good.
And Erna was actually quite insistent that they'd had 12 years in this very smoky, noisy, dusty environment, crowded environment.
Time to upgrade.
Let's go to a leafier place. Yeah.
Great.
And also, another trigger for this was the fact that some regulations about these kind of one-man medical practices meant that Döblin was about to lose half his income from the insurance companies that covered the patient fees.
Okay.
And so he was.
So his practice was in decline.
Practically, his practice was in decline.
Okay.
Even in 1931.
Okay.
So in 1931, they moved out to the west of Berlin. But another little disappointment connected with this, even though some Berlin newspapers had been suggesting that it was time Alfred Döblin got the Nobel Prize. 2 weeks after Alexanderplatz was published, Thomas Mann was awarded the Nobel Prize.
Okay. Well, I imagine, you have to. There has to have been some kind of like a long time. If it's only 2 weeks and then
obviously. Yeah, but no, people have been suggesting it, for a few years already.
Okay.
But the thing about the award to Thomas Mann was that they made it expressly for his first novel, which was published in 1900.
Oh, controversial.
And they had ignored his later work. So Thomas Mann was a bit miffed.
Okay. So they're both miffed. Interesting. Yeah. All right. Yeah. We've covered a lot of detail today. I know you've done a lot of talking. I wonder if it's time for our reading.
Okay. I thought what I'd select is a radio broadcast that Döblin gave in April 1930, where he was asked to speak about his life. The manuscript is incomplete. It was discovered in the archive. There's obviously some pages missing from the beginning. And apparently, this radio broadcast aroused quite a bit of controversy within the family, and they thought that he'd said things that he shouldn't have said.
Ooh.
But that's not clear from the pages that still exist.
Love a bit of
from the
controversy.
archive.
Okay. Do you think it was redacted for the archive then?
I'm not sure. There's such enormous amounts of paper.
Okay.
I mean, it's not strange that some pages might have gone missing.
Okay.
But there may well be some bits of this radio broadcast that we're not now privileged to know, the contents.
Okay.
Right, so this is Alfred Döblin speaking about his life in April 1930 on Radio Berlin. So all of my scribbling has always been an unending striving to stay on the heels of insights. Over the years I've written several books. No book is complete. Even though I'm a member of the Academy of Arts, I dispute whether my books have anything to do with art in today's sense. I don't denigrate art. All I assert is that I've always had an aversion, a distaste for the arts. My intellectual activity serves other things. It's a constant process of reflection, an uninterrupted and serious conversation about truth, engaging with and working through what I see and experience, and my stance towards it, either affirming or rejecting. A person can think in different ways. We use the word think only for logical and abstract activity. But in my view, you can also think in sounds, musically, or in stone, sculpturally, or in buildings, architectonically, and also in products of the imagination. These are different modes. In part, they're stages of thought, and each stage has its truth, and just as contact with abstract truth, with some perception, gladdens and nurtures, just so does contact with the truth and order of music and literature. I won't go into detail of how I had to struggle when at first I had no medical practice of my own. For half the day I was assistant doctor, I stood in for colleagues, on duty day and night at the emergency room, economically an endless tacking with a pretty strong wind constantly whistling about my ears. That's part of existence. No one gets anything handed to him on a plate, and we're not here to live as rentiers. But to say something about the character of my labours, my thinking, my toil of an intellectual kind, belongs explicitly or implicitly to Berlin. It is from here that it has acquired and still acquires its decisive influences, its direction. I grew up in this great, stern, sober Berlin. It's the mother ground. This stone ocean is the mother ground of all my thoughts. It's the most perfidious thing in Germany to have people curse Berlin, its depravity, its squalor, or whatever. Berlin does have its pleasure quarters, a good part of them meant for visitors. But if you're going to talk about a house, you don't just look at a side room or inspect a rubbish bin. I only know that this town, where people dwell in the worst tenement slums in the world, know almost nothing but work, work, work. That here only work has a good conscience and never any pleasure, and anyone who doesn't know this does not know Berlin and has nothing to say about our city. These tenements, slums and factories have for decades provided the material for my vision and my thoughts. And if ever I spoke of China or India or Greenland, I was always speaking of Berlin, of this great, strong, sober Berlin that only a real man can love. This Berlin with its own fabulously expressive vernacular, of which, ridiculously enough, its own educated citizens are ashamed. And if you ask me what themes I have chosen and extracted from this stony ground, it is these. I saw how here the individual disappears, how here only active and suffering masses, the great collective, a mass of people in a revolutionary movement to shrug off its distress. That was the theme of my first book from before the war. The war came. I was in Lorraine at an army fever hospital. I pondered and wrote another book about the iron forces of war and how can it be possible to arrive at non-violence and true order. Back in Berlin, amid all the old walls, I saw the social struggles and described what technology and industry do to people and how they change from being tools for people to tyrants over humanity. Then, in the book before last, I chose an Indian milieu. The theme was already very active. The book declared that we need to clean up, to break through all the old clutter. In my most recent book, I was openly back in Berlin. It had been a long journey. I'm back home, but the journey is not yet ended. Earlier, I quoted the saying, a child's education should end before birth, because a life consists in living through to the end its own birth dowry, its inheritance, but also doing what it has to do in order to let its future unfold of its own accord. You have to gain clarity about yourself and the things around you. And this is the task of every individual that no one can take away. And so I'm not afraid to reject allegiance to all today's slogans and programs, and do not run with any crowd. It's always been enough for me to stand on my own 2 legs. A serious person is never spared a little loneliness. I have to say this in an era that abuses very good words about the collective, about the masses that form society. They say collective, but it's a mob that's been rounded up by drumbeats and soon disintegrates. Gatherings of people are necessary for all kinds of purposes and activities, but autonomy is no less necessary. I have nothing more to say just now about my life. It doesn't contain much external action, but thinking and shaping, especially ongoing thinking, is certainly one kind of action. And thus I conclude this report of my life with the self-evident remark that I may have been alive for a long time already, but only begin to exist from this moment on.
Oh, lovely. It's like a love letter. It's a love affair with Berlin.
Yes, and it's so nice to have somebody being authentically to support an important component of society that all the good thinkers despise and deride.
He is talking about all of it, isn't
Yes.
he? Not just a little bit.
Yes,
Yeah.
but when we come to do the Berlin Alexanderplatz episode, we'll have some interesting things to say about the
Nose
reader
to tail.
response when it was serialised in a newspaper. There's some very, very interesting reactions.
Yeah. Well, I guess when he said, what was it he said? Oh, hang on. I'm to turn the bit where it's like, it's the most perfidious thing in Germany to have people curse Berlin. It's depravity, it's squalor.
Yeah, but if that's only the surface.
Yeah.
And he was always trying to dig below the surface.
Yeah.
What is the reality of a lived life? What is the reality of the social mechanism beneath this tawdry, crowded, dirty surface? Yeah.
And a lot of the really detailed content within his epics.
Yes.
Isn't it?
Yes, digging beneath the surface. This
Digging
was
beneath
his
the
mission.
surface.
Yeah.
I brought to mind, is it in Wallenstein? I'm not sure. The passage about the mosquitoes. Is that Wallenstein?
Yes.
Oh, look at me. How great. Oh, my goodness. I'm learning things. Excellent.
Yeah.
Okay. Right. I think it's time to say goodbye.
Okay, I think that was a fairly meaty episode.
It was a long episode. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, we're very real here. I'm not going to edit this episode down as much as previous episodes. And you may have heard there was a rattling halfway through your reading. I don't know, Chris, if you were aware of it. But it was...
This is my dog who rattles her ears very noisily.
Chris has a very lanky greyhound. And she did a big stretch and rattled her ears and then flopped back down again. So it's good. I think that makes it a bit more real for us. So
Yes,
I've decided actually that Döblin would approve of things like that because that's
Yes.
the meaty everyday, digging beneath the surface. So we should keep it in. Right.
Good. Yes.
Good.
Okay, well, goodbye, everyone, and we'll be back with another episode very shortly.
Excellent. Goodbye from me.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Epic Worlds of Alfred Döblin. Join us next time to explore more about this fascinating writer's life and works. Meanwhile, visit the website beyond-alexanderplatz.com for posts about Döblin and some of his unjustly neglected contemporaries, as well as downloads of translations. So until next time, happy reading!